Selected parts from the book One Life is Not Enough, written by Shri K. Natwar Singh. Part 9. My posting in China lasted for 22 months, and on 2nd May 1958 I left Peking both happy as well as sad. Mao Zedong's China had impressed me. It had also depressed me. I caught a P&O ship in Hong Kong. After 17 days, I reached Bombay and stayed with Krishna Huti Singh for a couple of days. On 31st March 1959, I escorted the IFS probationers of the 1958 batch for their meeting with Jawaharlal Nehru in his South Block office. He had by now given up the practice of meeting probationers individually. During this meeting, the Foreign Secretary Subimal Dutt walked in and whispered something to Nehru, and the Prime Minister announced that he had to leave for Parliament to attend to an important matter. The probationers and I were left to speculate, but the mystery was soon resolved. His Holiness the Dalai Lama had crossed the Indo-Tibet border on the same morning with a large party and was seeking political asylum in India. The Chinese people reacted ferociously. Chairman Mao called Nehru half man and half devil, and the Chinese task was to wash off his face so that it wouldn't be frightening like a devil's. The Dalai Lama arrived in Delhi after a few days' rest in Tejpur, Assam. He was put up at Hyderabad House, and I was attached as liaison officer. The Dalai Lama spoke no English, but this linguistic shortcoming in no way diminished his presence and charm. His smile was enchanting, and his eyes seemed to be an extension of his smile. China receded into the background for a short while when US President Dwight D. Eisenhower arrived on a state visit in December, the first American president to do so. However, the euphoria of Eisenhower's visit did not last long. Ominous clouds were gathering on the Sino-Indian horizon. The breaking point had not been reached, yet the future looked bleak. Zhou Enlai invited Nehru to visit China. Due to other commitments, Nehru had to decline, but he invited Zhou to visit India instead. Zhou Enlai accepted Nehru's invitation to come to New Delhi for talks to resolve the Sino-Indian border dispute, arriving on 20th April 1960, accompanied by the outspoken Foreign Minister Marshal Chen Yi. However, He could not resist reminding Nehru that this was his third visit to India, whereas Nehru had been to China only once. The reception at Palam Airport was correct but cool. Zhou Enlai's speech was more friendly than that of Jawaharlal Nehru's. Zhou Enlai came to Delhi in April. It was to be the last meeting of these two men with so much in common: intelligence, finesse, sensitivity to wider issues. Easily at that time the world's two most intellectual prime ministers. But Zhou had always a clear idea than Nehru of where power and interest lay. I had been deputed as liaison officer attached to the Chinese Prime Minister Zhou Enlai, and R.N. Kao was the security officer. Nehru told the Chinese Prime Minister that some of his senior cabinet ministers would call on him. Being the shrewd man that he was, Zhou insisted that he would call on them instead. I accompanied Zhou when he met Vice President S. Radhakrishnan, Home Minister Govind Vallabh Pant, and Finance Minister Morarji Desai. Though not one of them was familiar with the complexities of the Sino-Indian border, they chose to go into the specifics. The Vice President Radhakrishnan and the Finance Minister Morarji Desai thus succeeded in irritating the Chinese Prime Minister. The Vice President began by saying that the Sino-Indian border problem should be settled during Prime Minister Nehru's lifetime. The Chinese leaders found this incomprehensible. The Vice President said that the two countries had no conflict in 2000 years and war would be no solution. To this, the Foreign Minister of China, Marshal Qi Yi, replied that China did not want war. He had first-hand knowledge of war. For 30 years, the Communist Party of China had fought against the Chiang Kai-shek government and the Japanese imperialists. He himself had seen his wife and son being executed across a river. The Vice President Radhakrishnan then asked what 400 square miles of territory was compared to the friendship of 400 million Indians. Prime Minister Zhou Enlai replied, what were a few thousand acres of land compared to the friendship of 600 million Chinese? The Vice President was no match for Zhou Enlai. The Vice President was somewhat condescending and his generalizations were laced with philosophical sentimentality. Morarji Desai was at his self-righteous worst. He was abrasive and uncouth, and I was aghast at his behavior. After the unpropitious encounter with Morarji Desai, Zhou Enlai said to me, I am discussing the border question with Prime Minister Nehru. Why are my courtesy calls being used to lecture me? I had this query conveyed to the Prime Minister. It was on the third day of the visit that a cartoon depicting Zhou Enlai as a snake appeared on the front page of a national newspaper. In another cartoon, he was shown with a broad grin coming out of Teen Murthy House after a session with Nehru. The two cartoons were offensive by any standard, and the normally imperturbed Chow was livid. If I come out smiling, I am criticized. If I do not smile, I am criticized. Why do such things appear in your newspapers? He asked me. My response was that we had a free press and that if Nehru had been lampooned. With some asperity, Chow Enlai asked, "Do you think this proper?" I kept quiet. The failure of those talks is one of the most painful episodes of Indian history. They broke down irretrievably. The fact was that Chow Enlai outwitted the Indian Prime Minister because he had the facts on his fingertips and set off a chain of events that spiraled into the disastrous Indo-China War of 1962. Having completed 3 years at headquarters, I was posted to London as private secretary to Vijayalakshmi Pandit, the High Commissioner. She turned me down as I was close to her sister Krishna Huti Singh, with whom she didn't get along. Both sisters had a well-developed streak of self-destructiveness which made them say and do things which in calmer moments they no doubt regretted. Their temperaments were very different, but both were given to inspired indiscretion. Instead of London, the ministry posted me to the permanent mission to the United Nations, a much more worthwhile job. I arrived in New York on 21st August 1961 and spent nearly 5 years there. For any diplomat, the United Nations is the best university the globe has to offer. I landed in New York with an inbuilt prejudice against the Yankees. My intellectual center of gravity was Cambridge, England, rather than Cambridge, Massachusetts. Not only that, I was also hugely critical and disdainful of US foreign policy. Manhattan, with its bridges, buildings, its frenetic pace, its glamour, intensity, wealth, Broadway, the Empire State Building, and the skyscrapers was impressive. However, I was not overwhelmed and for several months took a supercilious and superficial view of the city. Yet, New York grew on me and I fell for the city. The 16th annual session of the General Assembly was to begin on 19th September 1961. Just 2 days short of this, the Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld perished in a plane crash near Dola, Zambia. This cast a pall of gloom over the session, particularly as Dag was much admired. He was subtle, cultured, widely read, and intuitively wise enough to espouse the cause of history. He stood up to Nikita Khrushchev in a debate on Congo in the General Assembly in November 1960 when Khrushchev had vilified him. Khrushchev said, "If he, that is Dag, himself cannot muster the courage to resign in, let us say, a chivalrous way, we shall draw the inevitable conclusions from the situation. There is no room for a man who has violated the elementary principles of justice in such an important post as that of the Secretary General. The Secretary General, Dag, replied the next day. The representative of the Soviet Union spoke of courage. It is very easy to resign. It is not easy to stay on. It is easy to bow to the wish of a big power. It is another matter to resist. By resigning, I would, at the present difficult and dangerous juncture, throw the organization to the winds. I have no right to do so. The General Assembly gave him a 5-minute standing ovation. The vacancy caused by the death of Dag was filled by the gentle Buddhist U Thant of Burma. One or two misguided Indian aspirants cut very sorry figures. Krishna Menon was keen for Arthur Lal, one of his favorite Indian ambassadors, to get the job, but he found no takers and the proposal was dead the moment it was made. Next, he attempted to push the name of Mr. Chako, a Malayali Christian who held a junior post in the United Nations. This proposal provoked uninhibited laughter. Another undeclared person who was keen to get to the 38th floor of the United Nations building was Braj Kumar Nehru. In his autobiography, Nice Guys Finish Second, he claims that Krishna Menon, of all people, asked him if he would like to be Secretary General and regrets woefully his mistake in showing no interest in the job. How a man of such experience and wisdom could convince himself that he was done out of the job by his own folly is beyond me. Anyone acquainted with the functioning of the United Nations would be aware of the unwritten rule that the United Nations Secretary General must come from a small country. R.K. Narayan was in town. He opened several doors for me. We had re-established contact when he came to Delhi in March 1961 to receive the Sahitya Akademi Award for the best book in English for his novel The Guide. At the time, I had asked him if there was anything I could do for him while he was in Delhi. He was keen to meet Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru and see the Mughal gardens in Rashtrapati Bhavan. Somehow I managed both. I took him to Teen Murti House where Pandit Nehru confessed that he had not read any of R.K.'s novels, though his niece Tara had. He introduced Indira Gandhi to R.K. as well. R.K. had been very pleased and excited by the meeting. He asked me to send him the photographs taken on the occasion. This was atypical because normally he avoided publicity. That is why a few years later I was surprised when he did not mention it in his autobiography, My Days. I spoke to R.K. about it. He said it never occurred to him to exploit the occasion and, in any case, he could not have woven the incident into the narrative. In the late summer of 1962, actor-director Dev Anand was in New York. He contacted me as he had heard that I was a friend of R.K. Narayan. He asked me if I could give him a letter of introduction as he wanted to adapt R.K. Narayan's novel The Guide into a film. I obliged, and R.K. Narayan's reply was encouraging. It was a awful good of you to have given my address to Dev Anand, who wrote to me and then met me, and we have arrived at a very satisfactory arrangement for the production of the guide both in Hindi and English. Through R.K. Narayan, I came to know James T. Farrell, the marvelously unkempt author of Stud Lunigan, which he wrote at the age of 26. R.K. also introduced me to Santa Ramarao. For over a decade and a half, Santa was the best known Indian writer in English in the US. Her father, Sir Benigal Ramarao, had been the Indian ambassador to the US. Santa was herself educated in the US and settled in New York after marrying Fobin Bowes, himself an author. It was as good a beginning as I could hope for in a new environment and uncharted territory. Shanta introduced me to Raja Rao of Kantapura fame. She was regularly reviewing books for the New York Times Book Review and the Saturday Review. She suggested to them that I should be included on their list of book reviewers. I reviewed books for both between 1962 and 1966. I remember Santa taking RK and me to a party hosted by John Gunther and his wife at their magnificent apartment. Assembled were many well-known, powerful, glamorous, rich authors, actors, diplomats, and eccentric musicians. Santa introduced me to Maura Budberg, friend of H.G. Wells. A little later, I saw her talking to another beautiful lady and asked her who she was. Greta Garbo, you dope, said Santa. Garbo was a legend seldom seen in public. RK told me that he was teaching Greta Garbo yoga. Santa passed away in New York in 2011 at the age of 85. Thank you for listening. The vice president was somewhat condescending and his generalizations were laced with philosophical sentimentality. Condescending. Condescending means treating someone as if you are more important or more intelligent than them. Morarji Desai was at his self-righteous worst. He was abrasive and uncouth. ABRASAVE, abrasive means rude and unfriendly. Uncouth, UNCOUTH, uncouth means lacking good manners. I was aghast at his behavior. After the unpropitious encounter with Morarji Desai, Chow En-lai said to me, I am discussing the border question with Prime Minister Nehru. Why are my courtesy calls being used to lecture me? Unpropitious, UNPROPITIOUS, unpropitious means not likely to be successful. My response was that we had a free press and that if Nehru had been lampooned, LAMPOONED, lampooned means to criticize a famous person by a drawing or a piece of writing. With some asperity, Chow En-lai asked, do you think this proper? I kept quiet. Asperity, ASPERATY, asperity means harshness of tone or manner. However, I was not overwhelmed and for several months took a supercilious and superficial view of the New York City. Supercilious, SUPERCILIOUS, supercilious means arrogant, haughty. Superficial, superficial, superficial means exterior, outer. Thank you very much.